Hi, my name is Tim Dionysiopoulos, and I'm a reporter for the Leadership Institute's Campus Reform. Today, though, I'm hosting a lecture, an online webinar with the Leadership Institute and our sponsors, the Tea Party Patriots, on Rules for Radicals with my colleague, Chris Doss, the Deputy Director for Grassroots. Welcome to the program, Chris. I'm excited to get started. This should be a fun lecture that we have going on today. I'm sure there's a lot of grassroots activists out there watching. If you are watching, make sure to go and email your questions to live@leadershipinstitute.org, or feel free to tweet them if you're on Twitter with the hashtag Leadership Institute or LI webinar. I'm so sorry about that. Once again, hashtag LI webinar. So, well, without further ado, let's get started. Chris, I'm excited to learn about how grassroots activists can effectively employ political technology, which we know is philosophically neutral, to advocate on behalf of conservative principles.
Thanks very much, Tim. I appreciate it. And thanks to all of you out there who've signed in today. Appreciate the time you're taking to learn a little bit more about Alinsky and the Rules for Radicals. I've been given a very dubious task today because this lecture today is based on a 3-hour workshop, and I've been asked to reduce a 3-hour workshop to fewer than 60 minutes, and it's a tough thing to do. So I'm going to telescope our workshop into about 50 minutes, a little less than that. And if you want to get the full workshop, all you have to do is contact me in the Grassroots Department, and we can arrange to bring the full Rules for Radicals workshop to your area. Now, we have to start out with a context. Everything deserves a context. Saul Alinsky didn't write Rules for Radicals in a cave somewhere as a hermit. He had a background, he had an academic background, he had a background in left-wing activism before he got started. And we have to look behind the academics, the studies, the work that he had done in politics before he put this workbook together for radicals in the 1960s. We have to remember this is a very important book, a how-to book for leftists, how to take over America. Hillary Clinton did a thesis on this book. Barack Obama described it as his Bible when he was a community activist in Chicago. So we're going to look at the theory and history behind the community organizations that use this book, those that came before in the many decades leading up to Saul Alinsky, and how they affect us. We're going to look at the unified left-wing history in its context, starting from the 1960s when Alinsky wrote this book, but we're going to look at what came before it that based the foundation for Saul Alinsky. Now, if you want to understand the United States, the politics and the political history of this country, there are 3 books you have to master. One is, of course, the Federalist Papers. It describes the construct that Madison was such a genius about putting together. One is Democracy in America, written by Alexis de Tocqueville, a French author who came to America to see how this new nation was working. He came here in the early 1800s and fell in love with this country, and nothing described this new experiment in democracy better than Alexis de Tocqueville's book. But the third book, if you want to understand modern politics in America, is Rules for Radicals. Now, simultaneously, there are 3 documents everyone should master if they want to understand the political history of America. The first one, our founding document, the Declaration of Independence. Then, of course, the Constitution itself, the framework, the pattern that Madison wrote to construct a government. And last but not least, a document that was written contemporaneously with Rules for Radicals. It's called the Port Huron Statement or the Port Huron Manifesto. You can find it on the internet. And that was written by the radical leftists of the 60s. It was their Declaration of Independence, their manifesto, what they wanted to turn the United States into. And that document, taken with Rules for Radicals, shows you what they wanted to do to the United States, and Saul Alinsky wrote them the guidebook how to get there through Rules for Radicals. What is the left? Where does it come from? Well, it started perhaps even before Karl Marx with the French philosopher Rousseau, who said nobody owns anything. Then Karl Marx came along. The French communes gave us the word communism. It evolved in England and throughout the Anglo-Saxon world as Fabian socialism, socialism that's not based on armed revolution, but more on incremental revolution through peaceful means. But the 60s was distilled by the leftist students and professors of that era through two organizations called the Students for a Democratic Society and the Weathermen. They're the ones who wrote the Port Huron Statement, and they're the ones who really mastered Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. And they've led us to the governments we have in most locality states and certainly in the federal bureaucracies to contemporary statism. Now, where did the New Left come from? And what can we learn about our opponents by studying what came before them? Perhaps the cultural aspect of what they're doing is best understood by studying an Italian communist by the name of Antonio Gramsci. Joseph Stalin didn't like Gramsci because Gramsci said we really ought to abandon the armed revolutionary struggle and move towards incremental cultural change. He did most of his work in Italy, and he wanted to undermine Western standards by destroying the cultural norms of the day. He described the culture with the words cultural hegemony, the cultural domination, and he wanted to describe the culture gradually. This led to a group of Marxists in Germany known as the Frankfurt School, and they called themselves the cultural Marxists. And they, like Gramsci, focus more on culture than on Marxist economics. How do you change the culture? Their view of changing culture and bringing socialism, the tenets of Marx, into society, focused on a new definition of revolution. They looked at what they call rhetorical radicalism, changing the language. We see this with the PC movement all the time. How do we use words? How can words be manipulated to change the language and change the way people think and look at the world? They also understood that radicals have to look at the world the way it is in order to bring about gradual incremental change. They have to work within the system, focus on internal infiltration. They started with universities, moved into our education system and into our bureaucracies. By focusing on this sort of infiltration, it didn't require outright frontal assaults on the system.
Just real quick then, Chris, would you say this was a shift to more of a, from a worker-based revolution to sort of a cultural type thing?
Well, it was certainly a shift in thinking because Trotsky and Lenin and Stalin certainly wanted to focus on more instantaneous upheaval through the armed struggle. And these people understood that even if you managed to succeed by armed struggle in overthrowing a government, you still had the culture to deal with. Yeah. Why not go ahead and deal with the culture first? Wow. That seemed to be the easy way around. The left, by the time that Alinsky had come along, also had become much better at organizing the masses and organizing themselves. They realized that you didn't have to turn everyone into a true believing Marxist, that you yourself even could act in a schizophrenic manner. The whole point was simply to polarize people, to divide people into a mentality of thinking of the haves and have-nots, the masses versus the bourgeoisie, or as we heard in recent times, the 99% versus the 1%. By polarizing people, you don't have to make them all true believers or understanders of the tenets of Marx. You work within their experience. You try and build within them some core of idealism. You activate their curiosity, their irreverence for authority, captivate their imagination, use relativity to relate to them and build their emotions and their adherence to your structures. Saul Alinsky seems to have borrowed a lot from Sun Tzu's Art of War because he saw this as a constant struggle. Use whatever you have as a tactical approach. This is a constant battle, struggle, conflict, and it's about force. It's consciously deliberate acts by which human beings live with each other and deal with the world. And you're always at war because you're always trying to undermine the culture that exists. Saul Alinsky compared Rules for Radicals with Machiavelli's The Prince. He said The Prince was written by Machiavelli for the haves on how to hold power. And he said he wrote Rules for Radicals for the have-nots on how to take it away. So let's look at the rules themselves. Rule number 1, power is not what you have, but what your enemy thinks you have. If you can fool your adversaries, whether that's in a legislative battle, whether it's a threat of a boycott, no matter what sort of action you're taking, if you imply power and resources, you may fool your enemy into thinking you have more power, more organizational ability than you have. And that can be very powerful in and of itself. Rule number 2, never go outside the experience of your people. People aren't comfortable with things that they have no familiarity with. Now, it doesn't mean you aren't constantly training people to become familiar with new tactics, new ways of doing things. But you get people to do things that they are familiar with and they understand and they know. Rule number 3, always go outside the experience of your enemy. Keep your enemy always a little off kilter. Make sure your enemy doesn't know exactly how to respond. Increase uncertainty and fear. Make them address issues that are distracting, that they aren't expecting to address, that they might not know how to address. Rule number 4, make the enemy live up to their own book of rules. And this is extremely important, and this is straight out of Antonio Gramsci, the Italian communist. Catch your enemy lying and hold him to that, but don't hold yourself to any standards at all whatsoever. This is typical in all the campaigns we see waged by the left today. Make your enemy adhere to their bourgeois standards. That's the way they see it.
Chris, do you think we'd have one example of maybe how the left has done this, today, forced, or even the right has done it to the left, forced the other side to live by their own standards?
Well, I think we see it in a lot of recent campaigns. Anytime any candidate or politician on the right gets a statistic slightly wrong, the attack is immediately made. You're lying. You're exaggerating. On the other hand, we can have someone perhaps even in the White House earn many Pinocchios for telling things that aren't right. And, he was just making a misstatement. Yeah. They make excuses. So this is typical. Rule number 5, ridicule is man's most potent weapon. If you can turn your enemy into an object of ridicule, there's almost no defense for that. And for any of you who followed the presidential campaign in 2012, you may know what they did to Rick Santorum's name. And that was absolutely potent. It took millions of people on the left working together to make that happen. But when you can make someone a joke, make them a ridiculous figure, that is devastating. Number 6, a good tactic is one your people enjoy. Well, duh, of course. If people enjoy what they're doing, they will do it with more vigor and more imagination, and they'll be much more involved in the process. Rule number 7, a tactic that drags on too long becomes a drag. Your people get bored. They don't see any results. And it does become counterproductive. That, to some extent, is what happened with the Occupy movement. It just dragged on and on. Nobody saw anything happening, and eventually it just petered out. Rule number 8, keep pressure on. Don't give your adversary a chance to regroup. If you let up, it may give the crisis management team for your opponent a chance to figure out a way to counterattack. So always keep the pressure up. Rule number 9, the threat is usually more terrifying than the thing itself. And this works with the earlier rule to imply power. Adversaries will expend inordinate resources to defend themselves against a threat that you may not even have the power to fulfill. So make the threats imply the power, and you can really keep your adversaries off guard. Rule number 10. The major premise for tactics is that the development of operations that will maintain a constant pressure upon the opposition. Now, what this means in essence is the left is not in a battle. They're not in an election followed by a legislative battle. They are in constant war. On the right, we see politics like a basketball game. We go sit in the bleachers, we cheer for our team, then we go home, back to our families, our communities, our churches and synagogues, and we live our lives. That's not how the left sees it. The left sees this as constant war. Rule number 11, if you push a negative hard enough and deep enough, it will break through to its counter side. Now, what they mean by that is you keep pushing and pushing and pushing, and eventually you may win sympathy from the public at large, or you may push your opponent into overreacting, which can earn you sympathy from the public at large. Rule number 12, the price of a successful attack is having a constructive alternative. That is, you have to have a demand. You have to have a solution, because you may have your opponent simply cave in. This is especially true in legislative battles or demands for public policy changes. So you need to have a demand, so if they cave, you can tell them what you want. Rule number 13, and this is the favorite of the left. We see it in every campaign. We see it on MSNBC regularly. Pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, polarize it. They pick their targets on the right, and they try to make these people radioactive, hurling the epithet racist at anybody and everybody they want to make these people untouchable. That is their favorite.
Chris, we've got a question actually from Mike down in Atlanta. He wants to know why, in particular, conservatives tend to see things as a battle as opposed to a long war, and if this is kind of a natural tendency among conservatives.
I think it is a natural tendency upon conservatives, because statists by nature, collectivists, progressives, whatever they call themselves, they see the role of government as perfecting society. And they see government as the vehicle for perfecting a society. We who believe in limited government see society as improved through families, communities, individuals, not the power of the state. So we want to live our lives in that way, working in our families, working as individuals, working through our communities, our religious institutions, our charitable institutions. And politics, the role of the state should be minimal. Therefore, our involvement in politics and the state should also be minimal. That's not the way leftists see it. The role of the state becomes God to many of them. So, lessons we can learn. Leftists are playing for keeps. We need to play for keeps too. It isn't a game. It's a fight for power, power over our lives. The left won't play fair, and they will never give us credit for playing with restraint. Remember, no matter what we do, no matter what we say, we'll be accused of being racist Nazis. Number 2, know how to handle radicals. Know what to expect from them. Know this book that they're playing from. This is their rule book. It's not always to your advantage to be an extremist, as they are, because that will only play into their narrative. But when you're dealing with your own people, you need to approach people at their level of communication of experiences. You need to do that. Don't try and out-denounce the left. It won't get you any credit. They'll just denounce you as being far right. Try and do your best to keep coalitions on the right together and understanding that the main existential threat to this country is from the left. So we need to find ways wherever we have common ground for people who might be categorized as paleo-conservatives, neoconservatives, libertarians, social conservatives, and others. We may differ, but we need to work together against the united left. Do some of what the left does, not taking on any of their values or lack of values, but learn some tolerance and quiet internal opposition within the right, but maintain united opposition against the left, always pulling the American political spectrum in our direction. Start groups that appeal to different constituencies, because not all people are going to be attracted to one overarching group on the right. Many people will join Tea Parties, but some won't. Maybe they can be pushed into other groups, maybe single-issue advocacy groups on the right. But we need to mobilize people where they will be comfortable. We need to emphasize identity over ideology. That is to say, we need to associate the identity of Americans as individuals, as people who believe in individualism and limited government. We want people to side reflexively with us without having to convince them. So people as different as civil and economic libertarian and social conservatives, civic fraternal organizations, gun owners, Christian conservatives, all should understand that reflexively we oppose this existential threat to our nation. Remember, all politics is local and all politics is personal, and we can actually get more done if we remember that, because politics is most easily fought at the local level. If we focus on local and state politics above all else, we can influence what happens at the national level. National issues are what get us riled up. They get our dander up, they motivate us. But they also divert our attention from places where we can have real successes. And change at the local level can evolve into change at the national level. In fact, it will absolutely result in change at the national level. We develop our farm team by getting people elected at the local level. We need always to control our image and attack theirs. That's what they do. The politics of personal destruction, Alinsky's rule number 13, we need to control our image and we need to destroy theirs. We have to be on the offensive at all times. When we're playing defense, we're losing. This is the most important lesson. And remember, if you look at the political structure of America today, the bureaucracies, the educational institutions, are you really a conservative? Do you really want to conserve, to preserve educational institutions and bureaucracies as they exist today? Edmund Burke in his time was really a conservative. He had something to conserve. Do we want to preserve this structure? I don't think so. Don't settle with concessions, but keep going, keep moving. Keep the ball going further down the field. Keep moving the spectrum of American politics further to the right. We're not here to defend the status quo. We're here to change things. We want to dismantle and reassemble in the way that our founders envisioned our nation. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and Chris, I'd love to take some questions.
Yeah, we've got a quick question here from Hugh Evans, who wants to know, who and where are the people and organizations who are funding the radical left? It's all about following the money trail. Chris, where do you think this money trail leads to?
Well, the obvious beginning of the money trail is union money. That's the SEIU for one, the Service Employees International Union, AFL-CIO. George Soros and the Tides Foundation come to mind, but there are a variety of them. You'd be shocked to learn that a lot of organizations on the left use Alinskyite tactics to blackmail large corporations into donating to them. Look at the Enviro-Left organization, Sierra Club, for example. They get lots of money from major corporations who pay them because they've been threatened with boycotts. We'll accuse you of being anti-environment. We'll accuse your organization of being a racist organization. So actually, corporations fund a lot of the left. But you're exactly right. The money trail tells you a lot about what's going on. But they use Alinskyite blackmail tactics to get money from corporations in addition to the Soros-type leftists, Progressive Insurance, and many others.
Sure. Got another question. Scott from Wyoming wants to know, why do conservatives seem to have a tendency to try to out-denounce the left? You see one member of the coalition come under attack in the liberal media, and then all of a sudden it seems like all their allies are trying to get as much media time denouncing them as well, or trying to move away from them. Why do you think this occurs? Is this another kind of natural tendency?
Well, I think it's an emotional tendency that any of us have when our dander gets up, when our blood pressure starts getting up. We have this knee-jerk reaction to want to jump into the fray. And sometimes we need to step back a little bit and see what's going on and figure out a better way of handling it. In our grassroots programs, we spend a lot of time on messaging and constructing what's called the Leesburg Grid. And knowing what your message should be at all times, being prepared, remembering that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, helps prevent you from jumping in too quickly with the wrong message.
Yeah. At what line do you think you would draw with, if you're working with your radicals, at what point would you kind of have to draw a line? And should you know that line prior to going into every battle, where you're going to defend and where you're actually going to, maybe have to say, well, this guy is a little bit too out there?
Well, you should have a line. Now, will you know it before every battle? No, that's not the nature of battles. You have to make decisions in the heat of fire in every battle. But you should have certain lines and certain standards that you will not cross at all times, absolutely. And if you spell that out, if you take the time when you're not in crisis mode to spell that out, you'll make better judgment calls in the heat of battle.
Sure. And then I guess my own personal question is, a lot of these, Alinsky tactics are very irreverent, and that's why they're so effective. And as conservatives, libertarians, generally we do have values, and that sometimes, do you think it makes it difficult for us to kind of employ these techniques on a personal level, and how can we overcome this?
Well, it absolutely makes it more difficult. They are going to hold us to standards, but we must maintain our standards. There's no question about it. Imitating the Alinskyites in every respect is not advisable, because we change who we are if we do that. Remember that Hayek says in The Road to Serfdom that for the left, for collectivists, their standard of morality is that the end justifies the means. And for us, to subjugate the individual becomes the abandonment of all ethics. And we have to remember that we lose who we are if we abandon our ethics. So we have to look at their tactics to know how to prepare for them. Some we may be able to emulate in some way. Others, we simply must know about them so we can defend against them better.
All right, we have another question coming in. This is from Jim Lamp. He's from St. Petersburg, Florida. I bet it's a lot nicer down there than it is up here in Arlington, Virginia. I think it's about 30 degrees outside today. Mr. Lamp wants to know, what is the history of the word progressive? What does it date back to, and why are they called progressives if they have this ideology?
Well, it's interesting. Our side of the spectrum was called the liberal side. We were the liberals up until around the turn of the last century. Jefferson being the original classical liberal, we put the word classical in front of it, but we were known as the liberals until approximately the turn of the last century. The progressive movement started in America in the late 1800s. And sometime in the early 1900s, the word progressive became a little bit tainted, and they began adopting for themselves the term liberal. And on our side of the spectrum, there wasn't really a good term until the late 1940s, 1950s, is when people really began to use the term conservative as opposed to liberal for our side of the spectrum. Then, of course, in the 1980s, with the Reagan Revolution, I think we should give a lot of credit to Ronald Reagan himself. He was a brilliant man in the sense that he had read much. He had mastered Bastiat and Hayek, so he was a great semanticist, a great wordsmith, and he did much in his speeches to discredit the term liberal, and liberals began to abandon that word and go back to progressive, which had lost any meaning. And now they're back at using the word progressive again.
All right, we've got another question here from Mike Corsello. Mike thinks we've been pushed around for too long. When we meet the left in battle, should we use equal or greater force when we originally identify our target and kind of hone in and go after them?
Well, that's a good question, and the first part is how you define equal or greater force. If we work smarter than they work, we don't necessarily have to outnumber them in people or even in money. And if we know how to defend against their tactics, we can win anyway. The Alinsky rules are pretty simple, and if we know what they're going to do, we have to remember they are very predictable, if nothing else. And knowing what they're going to be doing and knowing how they're going to be fighting, we do not necessarily ever have to match them dollar for dollar or activist for activist. We just have to work smarter.
All right. Daniel Oliver, writes in, and Chris, he's going to give you some creative control over Alinsky. He wants to know if you think Alinsky forgot any rules, or if you could add one in, what would it be?
Oh, that's a good question.
Excellent question.
Well, when I do this workshop, I like to do Sun Tzu's Art of War with it. I think if you want to augment what Alinsky has done, the best way to do it is to take a look at Sun Tzu's Art of War. There are a number of rules of battle in Sun Tzu's Art of War that are useful in the political world as well. So I wouldn't say there's any one rule I would add, but if you want to augment your effectiveness as an activist, the next book you should master after Rules for Radicals is Sun Tzu's Art of War.
All right, and one of our final questions. We've got Arete Patterson. I apologize the pronunciation there, but she wants to know how would we go about arranging the 3-hour workshop for our Tea Party group?
Well, all you have to do is contact me in the grassroots department, and my email is CDOSS, that's short for Christopher Doss, CDOSS @leadershipinstitute.org. And we'd love to come down and do the full workshop for you.
All right, Chris, just to close out, if we could draw one important lesson from Alinsky and apply this, political technology for, conservative principles, what would you say is the core message here that Alinsky is kind of trying to get across?
For collectivists, changing the culture is a constant battle in which they are involved in their daily lives. And we must master their tactics and strategies in order not to be swept up in this cultural change they're seeking.
All right. Well, Chris, thanks for coming on today. I think it was an incredible lecture. Some very, very important information put out there. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching, and feel free to contact the Leadership Institute if you'd like to bring this training to your region of the country, or we have many trainings over 40 different schools, many of which are here at our headquarters in Arlington, Virginia throughout the year. Check those out on leadershipinstitute.org and click on the training tab on our new website design. And from there out, if you have any more questions, feel free to contact us. This was put on in partnership with our co-sponsors, the Tea Party Patriots. So thank you to them for all of their help with this. And we hope you enjoyed the webinar, and I'm sure we'll have this up online if you'd like to rewatch it and learn these lessons. So thanks, and have a great Tuesday.